All right. All right. So we've talked about some of the basic principle stuff. We've talked about intermediate activities in terms of tree planting and lawn conversion. Amy did a great job, I think, kind of balancing the larger acreage stuff with even small down to the small sub-acre level. And obviously, it seems like she has a lot of fun doing it. So that's great. And it is rewarding, when you get out and you do things on your property. I've been on my property since 1991, and as I showed you that picture, as it's developed, we've seen the wildlife change, along with the vegetation. It's exactly clear. That's exactly what happens. As the habitat changes, the wildlife changes. So it's pretty neat. What I want to spend a few minutes talking about now are kind of managing existing natural areas. Some of the tools and practices we can use, and talk a little bit about just ID, maybe a couple of the prominent invasive exotic species that we deal with, and talk a little bit about tools too. And after that, I just want to have you maybe go back into your groups for just for a short period of time and just plan out an activity that's listed out in the agenda, and we should have no problem being out of here well on time. So does that sound acceptable to everybody?
Yep.
Okay. And I do have an evaluation for you to fill out, okay? And that's really important to us. So I really, before, if someone has to leave or something, I hope not, but I really need to get these back from you so we get some feedback. Okay, so we've talked about, the mowed areas, what to do with those. Now, what about when we have existing, natural areas? That becomes a little challenging for some people because a lot of the commercial forestry practices, in many cases, are at such a level that it's difficult to do those on smaller acreages. But we're concerned about health and wildlife and products and all that kind of stuff, and we've gone through this process of identifying perhaps what some of those units that you have. So again, coming back to that big picture, saying that we're not talking about individuals, we're actually talking about this land area can be treated with some type of treatment. And that's the value of doing the maps and identifying the units. Like we said, we just kind of recapping a little bit the various successional stages that each of these units represents. What are some of the main species? Unfortunately, doing tree ID is kind of, I don't think we're going to get to that today, but it's kind of it takes quite a while. One of the biggest barriers to folks is tree identification. It's a real challenge, but that's the way it is. And whatever you do, I think the thing to realize is it's all about safety. And it's amazing how many people are killed and injured in tractor accidents. And frankly, some of the folks that are in this room, you come out of a more urban or suburban background, or you come out and you buy your first tractor, and and there is some real safety issues on how to properly use a tractor as well as a chainsaw. And especially when you use a chainsaw, it's very important to know how to use it, where to fell the trees where you want them, and you can identify the things here. Never park downhill of a tree you're cutting. When in doubt, park twice as far from the tree as tall. Just because you live within driving distance of a forest does not make you a lumberjack. And most importantly, always use your neighbor's truck. And I mentioned this earlier about this whole thing about leaving dead trees, and Amy mentioned it as well, as leaving snags, for wildlife. And you can create those snags as well, but cutting wood, dead wood on the ground basically creates a lot of habitat for, amphibians and insects and things that are used as part of the biota of the forest. So, and like I said, this is your real opportunity to change the composition of the forest, to get rid of some of those trees that have poor value, or they're of invasive species or whatever, exotic species, or they're just not desirable for one reason or another. And you can alter, because a forest is kind of like you grow radishes, right? You first plant radishes and you got 1 million radishes, right? You remove those radishes and thin them out, then that one radish that's left becomes very large. Well, a forest is basically exactly the same thing. It's just talking about bigger plants. So I want to talk a little bit about thinning, about how that does work, because we talked a little bit about, when I talked earlier, about how trees are competing with each other. And what's the most important thing that they're competing for? It's light, okay? Because if you really take any area, the water and the nutrients are going to pretty much be the same. It's the light that's going to change, okay? So they're competing for light, and so light's most important. So what thinning does, it reduces the density of trees, okay? And that's kind of known as timber stand improvement. It's this whole idea of you removing certain trees, leaving other trees, and they're going to take off. They're going to grow at a more rapid rate. We're going to talk a little bit about crop tree release, because this is an activity that a lot of folks in this room can use, and more like on weekend projects. And what that instead of like kind of thinning the forest overall, on a large scale, which is many times done with commercial timber harvesting, crop tree release is where we actually go through and you pick out certain trees that you want to clear around. In other words, you have oak trees. A lot of forests don't have that many oak trees, but if you have a few oaks, but they're being shaded out by the trees around them, they're being overtopped. And by removing the trees that surround them, opening that canopy, you're going to assure that those trees can grow into the future. All right? So you're identifying that crop tree. That crop tree is that tree that you're trying to favor. And it could be not just for timber, it could be for wildlife, because it has some wildlife value or aesthetic value. All right? So let's kind of keep those concepts in mind. And this is kind of what it looks like. Here's a forest. It's all about looking up. And that's how you really know what's happening in the forest, is looking up, because it's those crowns that are competing with each other for the sunlight to see what's going to happen. So this was a picture I wanted to show you earlier. This is what a thinning does, okay? All of a sudden, all that light resources available, those trees are actively growing to fill up that space, because you'd be surprised if you open up the canopy of a forest like this, in a couple of years, all those branches are going to fill it in. And as a result, it's going to produce, those trees that are left are going to grow at a faster rate in diameter, because they have more nutrients and stuff to work with. So that's the basic idea of thinning. Now, a lot of people ask, and this is like a rule of thumb, this is in the book, how far apart should trees be? And, this is very tricky when you start putting this stuff out here like this, but this is kind of a rule of thumb, okay? Let's say, I want to know how far apart these trees should be. So, if I estimate DBH is diameter breast height, when we talk about diameter in forests, we're always talking at 4.5 feet off the ground. It's called diameter breast height. Now I realize everybody's breasts are not 4.5 feet off the ground, but that's what we use in forestry, okay? So you're kind of looking at the forest in general for those larger trees. And you kind of estimate the average diameter of those trees out there. So you got some like this, and you got some like that, and you multiply that times 2, all right? And that's the number of feet between the trunks of the remaining trees that should be in general. So let's say that if those trees, this is a younger forest, and the trees are averaging around 5 inches, so these are smaller trees, right? Then the desired spacing would be about 10 feet apart. So those trees that you pick, should be your better quality trees, ones that already have it, are decent crown, right? They've already gotten up into the canopy a little bit, they're more dominant, more successful, okay? And if you want, it says wildlife, you want them closer. I'm not sure I agree with that, I should probably take that out. But the point is, this is basically gives you a rule of thumb by which to work with, all right? So if you have a forest where the trees are 15 inches in diameter, that's 30, okay? So that's, so that'd be 30 feet apart. And what happens with a forest is it naturally thins itself, right? So for example, Donna was talking about planting trees. A lot of times when they plant plantations, they plant about trees on a 10 by 10 spacing. That's 430 trees per acre. When you get to a mature forest, there's probably maybe 100 to 150 trees per acre. What happened to the rest of those trees? They died out in the process of competition. So again, this whole idea of forestry practices is really just accelerating that natural thinning to manipulate it so that the trees that you want are left. All right? So crop tree management. And again, this is where you're identifying specific trees, and a lot of folks can do this. Now, when you get into really tall forests, this is maybe up beyond the resolve of some people, but a lot of these forests are relatively young, and you can clear around them. And this focuses on selecting individual trees, and the idea is to maximize the space. And it's based on goals and objectives, but so the idea is that you're concentrating potential growth on a certain tree. And the way it works is just the whole idea of light again, okay? it could be for firewood or lumber aesthetics, but usually you're determining trees that are the better quality trees that you want to be there for the future. This is your crop tree right here. And what we know from the way the trees grow, that tree's diameter growth, overall growth, is going to increase at a much rapid rate if it has clearance on 4 sides of its crown. As I look up into the canopy in the sky, if it's got space to grow into, that means it's producing leaves, producing carbohydrates, it's pushing them down because they're extra, basically, and it's going to produce a tree that's going to grow faster in diameter than one that's crowded in the forest. And it's barely just trying to survive, right? So this is really good for younger woods. This is an extreme example here, but you can see here's a tree. You see how narrow the crown is? Basically opened a big hole around that. And believe it or not, that tree is going to grow out and fill in that big hole. And if you were to go back there 5 years later and measure the diameter growth, you would see that tree grew with its rate of growth accelerated considerably. So this is a way for people to create bigger trees at a faster rate. All right? Now, and this is just a closer up. So here you have looking down at the canopy. Here's a crop tree. And so most cases, if you have some woods, and this is really good for small woodlands, you might go into a backyard woodland and maybe you select, 5 or 10 trees that are really nice trees that you really want there to be there for the future. And you can do as many as you want, and then you can focus your attention on those particular trees, and don't worry about the rest of the understory, because none of that understory is going to interfere with the growth of the trees. And people don't realize that. They think that by removing trees in the understory, that you're affecting the growth of the trees up top. That doesn't make sense, right? Because the reason those trees are growing is because of the light they're getting in the canopy. So the only thing that's going to affect the growth of those trees are the canopies of the trees that's surrounding it and stopping it from getting more light. Does that make sense, pretty much? Okay. So this is what crop tree release. And ideally, you want to release a tree on at least 3 sides. And so how do you remove those trees? Have you ever tried to cut down trees that are tightly packed together? Now is the time of year to do it, right? Wintertime, because you don't have all the vegetation. But in many cases, some of these trees can be cut down and used for firewood. In other cases, especially if they're smaller and you don't want to mess with them, the easier way is to either mechanically girdle them, to kill them, or chemically girdle them. So they just die in place. Because as soon as they die, the leaves die off. So even though the stem is there, they're still not providing any competition to that tree, right? Because they're dead. They're just standing dead. And that's the way a lot of crop tree management is done, is basically using either an axe, or using, I'll show you a technique with a hack and squirt with some like Roundup or something like that, and you're just killing the tree in place. Now, and if you want to take it down for firewood, that works too. But usually, having done a lot of that, you need a couple of people. Because a lot of times the crowns get caught up with each other, and you need somebody with a stick, pushing over on the tree to help get it some momentum, and then another person cutting the tree down or something like that. And it depends how much you want to mess with the chainsaw. So this is an example. This is a young stand like this, and you've got a lot of woods around like this, and you're probably thinking, well, how do I know what it's going to look like? And a good technique is to go out, get some ribbon, okay, and tag that tree that you want to use to identify as a crop tree, and then you can kind of go out there and you can kind of visualize what it's going to look like. You can say, well, these are the trees I have to cut down this one, and you start getting an idea visually what it's going to look like.
I have a question.
Yeah.
We have a problem in my neighborhood where we'll have one tree fall, hit another tree, hit another tree, hit another tree, hit the house.
Yeah.
How do we thin the forest? Is there any way to thin the forest to prevent that kind of thing from happening, where they're just hitting each other, knocking each other down?
Well, what you're talking about is really thinning, is doing actual thinning. More mature trees, obviously, right?
Oh yeah, like 80 feet high.
Are they yellow poplar trees, or?
It's oak.
Oak.
We have a lot of yellow poplars.
Yeah. Well, the only thing there really is to go in and do it actual, those thinning out those trees. And when you start getting close to houses, we're out of the realm of forestry. and we're into the realm of arboriculture, and then we're into the realm of money. Because when you're dealing with structures, it's much harder just to fell trees. You're talking about, well, they're going to have to take them apart in pieces, and it just costs a lot of money. So, but ideally, you want to do that before they hit the house. So, I mean, a good arborist or a good forester could identify those trees that are in danger of that happening. Because I do that around my house too. I planted so many trees, but now I'm cutting them down. And I've cut down ones that are pretty close to the house. But there's a few of them, frankly, even for me, I've cut a lot of timber and stuff. I still find a guy who's an arborist guy to take it down because it's just not worth it. I'm not sure that I can get it to go that way. All right, this is an example of what thinning can do. This is given to me by a forester. And this is two what we call cookies, tree cookies, right? Slivers out of a tree, 2 different trees. And these are oak, a young oak forest. And it was about, I don't know, I think they were about 20 years old or something like about this age. And they were in 2 different parts of the forest. This part of the forest was not thinned, okay? And this part was, where the trees were thinned out so the crowns were released pretty much on all the sides, not using a crotch release, but just kind of going through in a forestry operation and thinning out the trees to an appropriate density. And what you see, this was after this was thinned, this was the growth for the next 25 years. In the property that was unthinned, that was the next 25 years. So thinning can have a real impact on diameter growth. That's the point. Now, is this going to happen all the time? No. I mean, these trees were, a lot of times, unfortunately, trees are suppressed for so long, and their growth is so suppressed for so long, they don't respond very well, even when they're opened up. But in many cases, they do. So this is the value of thinning trees, because you put that growth onto the trees that are left, those trees grow at a much more rapid rate. And when you look at it, this is actually, it shows the actual full diameter of the size of the 2 trees. So that red line is when the tree was thinned. And this would have been the size of the trees in the one part, and those were the size of the trees in the other. Big difference, right? And there is a I'm not sure how useful this, we kind of created this, we have not really field tested it too much, but trying to do an assessment of competition among trees is actually one of the activities in the book. And frankly, if you actually go out and do it, I'd be interested to see what you think about it, because some of these things are hard to create for someone with no, we developed this whole manual with the idea that you don't need any type of forestry or wildlife training or background at all to do the activities in that book. So sometimes that limits you exactly, are we going too far to do some of these things, but I don't think so. So if you do this, I'd be interested to see what you think about it. That was activity 10. Okay, so changing what grows, all right? We talked about this, about how you can thin trees, and we talked about crop tree release. Well, how do you actually manipulate the growth of those trees with different types of practices? And actually, Amy talked about girdling trees mechanically with a chainsaw, and we talked a little bit about doing it chemically. But if you are going to do it mechanically, you don't have, people make a mistake. The only part where you really need to cut is in the phloem tissue. And that's just a little ring of tissue under the bark that's about this wide. So if you're trying to girdle a tree and stop the downward movement of nutrients, you just have to go in a little ways, okay?
Like the samples there.
Yeah, you don't have to go in like this far, so the tree is like hanging on a little, I've seen it done. So, and the reason you do it twice is to, is that, so you can be sure you get all of it, because sometimes the trees will actually grow over it, believe it or not. All right? And some species are easier to kill than others, there's no question about it. The mechanical girdling, this is a really great technique. I know a lot of people are hesitant to use herbicides, but I will tell you that in terms of local application of herbicides with something like Roundup, this is called a hack and squirt. This is a, ooh. You don't want to, throw away the old Boy Scout axe, okay? Like, I think you said it, an axe is no good unless it's sharp, okay? This is a horticulture axe sold by Fiskars, and it's weighted. And basically what you do is you can use a hack and squirt. And about every 3 to 4 inches of diameter, you put a hack in there like this, and you have a spritzer bottle, and you use about 50% Roundup concentrate and 50% water, and you spray a spritzer full into the cut. And you can do a couple extras down at the bottom of the roots too if you want. And what happens is that phloem tissue that's going down into the roots is right under the bark. So it gets sucked right down into the roots. Now, when's the best time of year to do that? Usually starting in late June into July through November is the best time, but you can do it in the winter as well. What you want to avoid is the spring, because what's happening in the spring with the sap? It's coming up out of the ground, okay? And you're not going to get a very good impact. Don't waste your time. So starting in like February when the sap starts to run. But you can go through with a crop tree release, and you can do, I'd say, a lot of damage, but you can do a lot of management, alteration with this hack and squirt, and you don't have to worry about it, going off site. Now, the only thing you do have to worry about is there are a couple of species like yellow poplar is very susceptible to root grafting. So what that means is the trees are growing in the forest and their roots intermingle under the ground. So sometimes if you hit one tree, if it's too close, it'll actually cause some harm to the other trees nearby. And yellow poplar is probably the most common one, but as long as you're 5 or 10 feet away from those other trees, you're probably fine. All right. Any questions on that? But this is something that's available to most people, and it's great for dealing with invasives as well. You want to get invasive species, and the tree just kind of withers away and dies. All right. Grapevines. Like I told you earlier, this is my friend Mr. Sandvik. That's the name of the company that makes this, called SANVIK. But it's a Swedish brush axe, and it is weighted, has a stiff blade on it, and it's great for cutting grapevines. And again, you want to just cut grapevines off those trees that you really want to be prominent in the canopy. You don't want to remove every single grapevine, but especially the ones that are going to rip the trees down. In many cases, you see a lot of this. This is like what I call a grape arbor, where the vines have totally infested that area. And in those cases, you're probably better off just to leave those areas alone. Just allow it to become an arbor, and you realize that it's probably not going to be much that's going to happen with trees in there, and when it's snow and ice, they're probably going to rip down, but there's a lot of wildlife that lives in there as well. But the result of this as well is when you get snow and ice storms, then you're not going to lose a lot of branches out of your big trees, and that trees aren't going to get pulled to the ground. This probably costs about $30 or something like that.
What's the benefit of that design?
Because it's weighted. If you hit it like this, and if you push a tree over, you can cut trees up to 5 inches in diameter with this. You put a little pressure on them, and you whack it, and it just splits it, cuts off, and then you can hit it again.
Well, I don't understand how that's better than a conventional axe.
Well, you get the leverage. This is built with leverage, the way it's built. You'll see it if you come up here and you can mess with it a little bit. I used to do a lot of surveying, and this was the surveyor's friend, because you could literally cut trees down this big with it. Put some pressure on them. So, yeah, the only problem with an axe is very dangerous. And the other reason is safety, because this has a stiff blade, and it stays in the tree. An axe, what happens is it gets dull, you get tired, it bounces off the tree, and it goes into your leg. The same with machetes. Very dangerous things to use on a long term. You're better off with something like this. I mean, I've seen people just massacre themselves with machetes and axes. And it's okay for the first 5, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, but you get tired pretty quick doing that. Talk a little bit just about harvesting, but most people don't realize, like I said, that the woods that are out there have been harvested many times. This was a clear cut at the turn of the century. If you went into that forest now, 60 years later, that's what it looked like. Most people would never have any idea of the past history of that woodland. So I guess what I'm saying, in some ways, you want to be concerned about what you're doing in the woods, but the forests are incredibly resilient and renewable. I mean, you don't have to be be cautious and responsible, but you're not overly so. A lot of things have happened around our area recently that I think have made people changed their outlook that letting nature take its course is a good thing. Forest Service has told me a lot of their folks are getting a lot of calls because of what's happened with Hurricane Sandy, for example. A lot of people have had a lot of blowdown, a lot of woods, trees coming down in the forest. I talked a little bit about emerald ash borer in terms of the future of that, gypsy moth, Asian longhorn beetle. Who knows what's down the road next. So it really pays to be kind of a little knowledgeable about what these invasive, these species, exotic species are that are, and how susceptible your forest, your woodland area might be to those things. And the information is there. Okay, I talked a little about logging. I'm not going to get into that too much. That can be done, but you would really want to use one of those foresters that's in that directory. And this is just an example of I know people talk about clear cutting, but you remember when I talked about ecological principles, about tolerance of different trees? The real interesting thing that comes up with forestry is people say, well, clear cutting's bad. The only problem is that most of the trees that we really like to see in the forest are shade intolerant. In other words, they need full sunlight. The only way you get full sunlight is if you remove the canopy. And the typical practice that's done is some type of a clear cut or some type of a canopy removal. So you're kind of caught in a catch-22. If you want to regenerate a lot of the species that we desire, you really need to remove the canopy of trees. And that's kind of the rub there, because there's not that many intolerant trees that really are overly desirable in some cases. So this is just an example of what a couple of forestry practices look like. This was a small clear-cut area, and this is what it looked like 10 years later. And of course, those trees would start to thin themselves out. This was a small cutting, what's called a group cutting. This was a couple acre cutting, and this is what it looked like 6 years later. And most people, like I said, after that initial cutting, after a couple of years, most people probably wouldn't notice too much of a difference. And again, when we talk about regenerating forests, those trees that are out there, those big trees, every tree has its day. And depending upon the site, sometimes that comes sooner than later. A lot of people have forests that are made up with a lot of black oak, for example. And black oak is a great oak, but it's not a real long-lived oak. Certain these trees reach a certain size when they're going to start to rot and decay. So, it pays to understand that at some point you need to regenerate things and move on. And whether that's going to happen on your small woodland is probably, questionable. But there's things that you can do to encourage the young trees to come up. And in most cases, that's going to require opening up the canopy a little bit to allow those smaller trees to grow or to allow some regeneration to take place. Just a little talk about enhancing recreation and aesthetics. And that whole idea of, we have a forestry volunteer program we call Maryland Woodland Stewards. And in fact, if anybody here is interested in that, we do a training, we're doing it this year, where I pick folks who are interested in being volunteers, and we put them through a 3.5-day forest and wildlife training. It's basically a forestry and wildlife short course. And in return for that training, they agree to talk to their friends and neighbors about sound forest wildlife management, and encourage them to get professional assistance or provide them information. And we've been doing it for a number of years, and if you are interested in it, we'll be taking applications. And if you go on our website at naturalresources.umd.edu, you'll find Master Woodlands, Maryland Woodland Stewards under there. But one of the things, one of our volunteers, phrases they came up with is, build the trail and tell the tale. And one of the ways you really can enjoy your property is if you build a trail and you start learning about things, and you can share those things with other people because you start learning a lot about your woodland, little things. And works good for tree ID too, because you have this area and you take someone for a walk, and then you've taken the time to identify that that's a white oak, and that's a red oak, and you can say, yeah, that's a white oak. I don't know if you impress people that way. But, and like I said about building trails and telling tales, this is one of the best ways for folks to really enjoy their woodlots, and kind of find interesting things that might be there. They could curve around, and I think it'll enhance the experience a lot. Whenever we get into forestry, remember I talked about soils, how important soils are? Protecting that upper layer, right, of soil, that's where your roots are. About, I think it's like 70 or 80% of the roots of the tree are probably within about 10 inches of the surface. So you want to protect that root mat. So if you're building trails or roads or anything, do your best to protect those things. And one of the things that comes up a lot is how water moves through your property. So if you have a road or something like that, we have a whole slew of things called best management practices. And in many cases, what that involves is trying to control water movement across the land. And you want to reduce the velocity of the water. So if you have a road, you want to put up berms and things that stop the water from building up velocity, and so you don't get a lot of erosion. So, and there's a whole slew of information on that, but like this is a little swale, it's called here. So the water coming down this road hits this bump, gets pulled off to the side, it slows it down, and it stops erosion from taking place. So as you think about building maybe a road into your property or something like that, these are things to consider. And cleaning out culverts, if you have culverts, those are important because they'll back up and cause flooding. So these are just a few considerations. There's a lot of tools out there. And I guess the one thing I would just challenge you to do is, to take some risks a little bit. I mean, don't be too hands off. The woods can take it, And this whole idea of thinning and trying to open up the forest floor can have an incredible amount of results in terms of the amount of vegetation that forms on the ground and the types of wildlife you're going to see. One of some people have actually done with the deer issue is they've actually fenced off properties. There is cheap fencing that's out there, but that's a whole different level of effort on itself. So you have any questions about any of that? Okay. Yeah.
Is there much value to pruning trees?
Well, pruning's a little bit different because then we're trying to, from a forestry point of view, pruning is done to enhance value because then you have clearer log which is the most valuable part of a tree. For arboriculture sense, you're pruning to, for other reasons, to get them out of the way and so things like that. But pruning is probably more beneficial for, lawns and around houses. But a lot of people do it as well to, maybe around trails and stuff to get branches out of the way. In what sense? What do you mean? In just pruning for?
To improve development.
We don't. In forestry, we do very little pruning. Like I said, the most pruning would be done in forestry would be on things like pine, like white pine, which does not self-prune itself. So they would prune up to 16 feet so that those knots would grow over, and you would have a very nice log after a certain number of years. Yeah. Hardwoods self-prune themselves, okay, in a forest context. And that's the one issue about why you want trees dense enough, because when you have the trees dense enough, what happens is you don't get those heavy branches formed because there's no light there. Yeah. So if you ever walk through the woods, I was mentioning this to you, I think, that you go through the woods and all of a sudden you'll come across this big old tree. It has these huge limbs coming out of the side of it. And what that was probably an old pasture at one time. And that was the old pasture tree. Had full sunlight, developed these huge side branches. It was abandoned, and what you got now is a bunch of smaller trees that are coming up, but you still have that big old tree there. Yeah. Okay.
One other question.
Yeah.
You heard anything about the chestnut trees that they planted at Oshawa? How was it doing?
What was the question?
Questions about the chestnut trees they've planted at Oshawa.
How are they doing?
I mean, a lot of people don't know the American chestnut was a primary component of the hardwood forest in this area, and killed by the chestnut blight. And they've been doing a lot of breeding to try and, primarily with the Chinese chestnut, to bring it back. Some people are more optimistic than others, but they planted a number of plantations around with some of the selections they've done. But
I did want to, at our Winemaker Center, that a year ago, I went through and assessed it to see what had died and what was still living and how much it had grown, and probably half of them had died. And some of them had just barely grown, and others had grown quite a bit. They were trying different cultivars, different, the different genetic background to see which ones would do well. So we were tracking which ones did make it and which ones didn't make it. And so they're expecting some of them to die, but so they're just right now trying to see what will make it.
If you're interested in that, there's a website, the American Chestnut Foundation. And you can go as deep in there as you want to about the genetics and the crossing. The goal is to have something with 1/16 Chinese chestnut, with that 16th being the resistant part, and the rest of the tree having all the other phenotype of the American chestnut. So, I mean, you can go as deep into genetic science as you want to with American chestnuts and find out. Hill County Forestry Board is working with the Board of Education on a project to plant forests on several elementary schools this year. And the Board of Education also has chestnut groves, 50 trees each at several of the high schools, and they will be expanding that program. And those are the ones that Carolyn was talking about, where they planted them to see which ones are going to go and which ones won't. The ones that go are the ones that want to use in the green program.
They have approximately 300 some trees, adult chestnut trees along the Appalachian Mountains that are producing chestnuts. They're doing that, they're planting different areas of different kind to see which will thrive in this area, which will molt. They're trying to reestablish them along the Appalachian Mountains.
Hope springs eternal.
I've got I only own 1 acre. I've got an American chestnut that's at least 3 years old because it was there when I moved in, and it's still there, and it hasn't died yet.
Yeah.
That was the argument that they provide. It's been infected by the fungus, but it has enough resistance that it hasn't died from it. So there's hope.
All right. So what we're going to do now, any other questions?
I have one question.
Yeah.
You talked about walking trails.
Mhm.
We actually have walking trails in our neighborhood, but it's been 10 years or so since they were put in. Do you know of any groups that might be able to like recut them or clear them out, or is that a Boy Scout kind of thing? Or?
She's asking about people who would do brush clearing for nothing.
Well,
And
well, it's already been done.
I'm just kidding.
Difficult to find.
I mean, actually, there are a lot of Eagle Scout projects do that. There are some people, but I don't know offhand. I think you'd have to find. Problem we run into anymore, insurance companies rule the roost, so you can't get anybody sharp tools. If they can't gnaw it with their teeth or pull it out with their hands, it's like, I don't think you're supposed to have anything. So that's kind of the issue, but I'm not sure I can. Actually, if it's been cut before, it's probably make it a little bit easier. But if any time, the best time of the year to work in the woods is right now, because you don't have all the heat and the bugs, and you can actually see. You can actually see what's going on, and that's a real benefit. So, all right. Let me see. Oops. Not sure what I did there. So what we're going to do now is, before we leave today, I want to give you opportunity to kind of take what you've heard, synthesize it a little bit, and put it into a couple of ideas. And in your book, okay, or on the sheets you have, Activity 18, okay? If you look at Activity 18, what it is I showed actually a slide of it earlier. It's different objectives to meet your goals. So it shows you potential projects that you can do to reach different goals. All right. What I'd like you to do is kind of look at that and mark some of those off that interest you. Identify a couple of ones that are there, and then on the next activity, which is Activity 19. Now, you have the case study, and there's also 2 additional case studies in there. What I'd like to ask you to do is to pick 1 or 2 projects. And you don't have to go into all the detail that's written out, but just try and fill some of this out and see what you can come up with. Okay, with a couple of ideas And what I like to do is maybe just take, 15 minutes or whatever it takes to do that, 20 minutes, just talk amongst yourselves, go into your groups again, and just take a couple minutes just to share what you all came up with. You can share with other people because it'll give other people's ideas, and then we'll be done. Does that sound okay? All right, so can we turn the lights on, please?